something fun here. This is a hybrid nylon string guitar. It's not a pure classical design. It's for the steel string player who wants the tone and playing characteristics of nylon with dimensions that are more familiar to steel string acoustic players. This one was built by a company called Cremona, with a K, and it's a Bulgarian instrument. We don't typically hear about Bulgaria as a center for lutherie, but there are distinctive string traditions in the Balkan states, and Bulgaria has been populated with so many different waves of various cultures: Greeks, Slavic, Ottoman, Persian empires, each with its own musical traditions. The sort of melting pot breeds a vernacular folk instrument culture. They have their own lute-like things or bowed strings as well. But of course, the global market has brought others, and guitar is pretty ubiquitous all over the world now. So, the Bulgarians make guitars. Cremona, again with a K, was founded by a fellow named Dimitar Georgiev, my apologies to native Bulgarian speakers, who started out as a mechanical engineer and a gunsmith. He got drafted into the army during World War I. The Balkans were a furious hotspot during the 1910s. They had a lot of fighting, like 3 different wars. But at that point, like 1/4 of the entire male population of Bulgaria was in uniform. So Georgiev brought his mandolin along and got used to repairing it in the trenches. Following the war, he didn't want anything to do with gunsmithery, and instead he formed a company with his brothers to build instruments. And to do that, he went and got himself trained with an apprenticeship in Markneukirchen, which is Germany's center for stringed instrument production. Most notably violins, but they make guitars too. So the basis for their methods and craft is essentially German. So now they've been doing it for 100 years. Player of note, Ali Farka Touré. All you blues players should know him. If you don't, I would expect you to do some research. He's a fascinating guy. He's from Mali, West Africa. He's a blues man, but he had no contact with American blues during his development. And the similarities are kind of scary. Musicologically, he's often pointed to as an evolutionary benchmark. It's like, this is obviously where the blues came from. Until he starts singing, you're going to assume that you're listening to John Lee Hooker or Lightning Hopkins. Anyway, he won some talent competitions in the early 60s in Africa, and he was sent to Bulgaria, of all places, to compete internationally, where I expect he picked up this novel-looking Cremona guitar. It's on a bunch of his album covers, and it sounds really great. So we're working on this for a player who has reduced strength in his fretting hand due to some neurological issues. So I'm going to try and set this up with the absolute lowest possible action. And we can talk about what that means for a nylon string guitar. Now, in my rather truncated career as a builder, I've made more classical guitars than anything else. And I've had the opportunity to attend some symposiums and speak with serious amateurs and professional classical artists. One thing that was really quite tricky when starting to build them is there is precious little written down about standard setup parameters for the classical guitar. The books on the subject that were available basically glossed over that part of the operation, and I think that may have been in part because the people who wrote those books and got them published, none of them, as far as I can tell, ever built a guitar that was used by a top professional, with maybe the exception of Arthur Overholzer. But his methods are very idiosyncratic by any definition, and that was a very long time ago. So I was using a 1-page summary in Dan Erlewine's repair book, in which he talked with a couple of well-regarded builders. The thing is, there was no consensus there, and talking with professional classical guitarists really played that out. Everyone had very different opinions, rock solid in their personal beliefs, of course, but different. One size does not fit all in the classical world. They're also a bit of a superstitious bunch and quite mystical. But a few things hold true. In general, nylon string action is higher than steel. Nylon is more supple. If you strum hard, the strings move in a wider arc. They could be prone to buzzing. They also don't require the same amount of compensation that the proportionally stiffer steel strings do. You'll note that the saddle is usually a straight line. It's not angled back. and that's because the tension between the strings is more consistent. Sometimes the G string will be filed back a bit, but many people don't even consider that necessary. Big name players who work in larger concert halls sometimes prefer extremely high action, because they're wringing every possible bit of volume out of the guitar, and they want to do that without a buzz. Flamenco players, however, the guitars they use at this point are very similar to classicals, but they like a lower action. And in many cases, they don't mind a bit of buzz on the bass strings. It's part of the sound. Relief in the neck. These guitars generally don't have truss rods, of course, and the actions are high enough that it's not a huge concern. Usually the string tension will pull the neck into adequate relief and they just don't worry too much about it. In this case, measuring at the 6th or 7th fret, we've got about 12 thousandths. Nut height, however, can be important, where I would usually set the bass string at about 21 or 22 thousandths. A classical is more like 25 or 27. In this case we got 25. It's right on. I remember my friend Emily Shaw, who was a competitive player and instructor. She tried some of my guitars and said that my nuts were too low. It was too easy in first position. You know, if she's barring an F, she wants to dig in and really work for it. So if I say classical action is 3.8 millimeters on the bass side, 3 on the treble, which would be like 5/32 of an inch, just over 1/8 of an inch, that's only true in the most general terms. Can we go lower? Yes. How low? Well, this guitar, as it comes to me, is set up at 6/64ths on the bass side, 4/64ths on the treble. That's like 2.3 millimeters and 1.6. That is actually too low for flamenco. Those people play really loud, really hard when they're strumming, those rasgueados. But in the case of calm jazz playing, this is just fine. This is steel string action on a classical guitar. I'm actually going to try and take it lower. The other thing that makes this a hybrid guitar is the nut width, which is just around 47 millimeters, which is under 1 7/8 of an inch. About the same as an old-time Martin. And, you know, that makes a big difference in the feel. The other thing is it has, well, maybe slightly less of a flat back to the neck. This is one of the major things that classical players require. They like a nice, wide, flat that runs down, you know, the length of the neck to facilitate their really kind of rigorous thumb positions. Jazz players and steel string players typically want to bring their thumb up and over, and they prefer a more rounded back. So this one, yeah, it is still pretty classical in shape, I'd say. I like these tuner buttons. They look delicious. There's an old-timey hard candy, a rock candy with a caramel flavoring called a humbug. That's what they remind me of. I must not eat them. So there's one mitigating factor to lowering the action on a neck like this, and that is sort of where the relief ends and what's going on with the fall away in the fingerboard extension. So I want to take this down more. The relief in the neck seems to end right at the body joint, and then it's pretty much straight. It's flat from there on. There isn't a fall away to speak of in this area up here, which is probably where we might end up with some issues. And in fact, it's worse on the bass side. The relief continues all the way to the last fret. So that's something I want to do, is dress some fall away in there, so when the player is accessing this wonderful cutaway body design, still playing pretty clean. Gets a little bit splatty. So I think it requires a bit of fall away. I'm going to mark the crossing points on the saddle for the ease. These are some silver strings that have well and truly tarnished. This nut is too loose. Well, strings are off, but again we find this saddle is much too loose in the slot. It can't be a super tight fit in this case because it's outfitted with an under-saddle pickup. This is one of those braided metallic strips. And if you have a saddle that's really tight, you don't end up putting enough energy down into it. However, in the case where it's too loose, what can happen is a lot of the energy is actually sort of pulled forward rather than going down. And over time, depending on seasonal changes, you can actually crack off the front side of the bridge. And plus, you're just losing so much energy transfer because there's a great big air gap around it. So less volume, less tone. Again, it can't be super tight, but I'd much rather see like a sliding fit. Now, how much fall away do we want to put in here? These frets are about 45 thousandths tall. Yeah, 45 to 48 thousandths. I think we're going to lose about 4 thousandths of an inch, like maybe around 10 to 15% again. At the very end here, gradually tapering up to nothing at around the 13th fret. No, it's not strictly necessary to tape off the board for something like this, but the rosewood has pores big enough to accept the little shavings of nickel, and I just don't like to get them in there. So this green painter's tape is just about 4 thousandths tall. They've recently made it thinner as part of shrinkflation without telling me. But 2 pieces on top of the fret number 12 should do me. That way when I run my sanding level over it, it's going to start taking material off the last couple of frets first and just produce a taper. I have to be careful, of course, not to wear through this tape all the way down to the fret. I'd have problems then. This has got 220 grit paper on it, which it's not as coarse as some people use and coarser than what others do. Frets in this area frequently end up a bit of a roller coaster for a number of reasons. Number one, when installing them, someone's hammering these in place on this guitar, and you want to be careful because these things have relatively thin tops and it's a delicate area. The other thing is, over time, the body joint can sort of kink a little bit so that you end up with a ski jump or a ramp at the end, and they just naturally start moving a bit because of that. So it's not uncommon to find, me removing some material up here where down here there's still a bit of a gap. So when I'm doing this, I'm starting with the 3-corner file. Each of these edges has been ground back so they're safe. Over on its side, basically. And then with successive passes, I roll it so that I'm taking a shaving closer to the center of the fret, and I'm sort of tracking my progress. 600 grit sandpaper, folded over on itself 3 times. This is flexible, it'll bend, and equal numbers of strokes. What this does is blend the slightly faceted surfaces I've just made together. 1200 grit sandpaper, the same deal. 2400 grit micro mesh. This has a fabric backing designed for use with a random orbit sander, but it's spongy and it really does sort of conform to the shape. And again, I dig in with the side of my fingernail. So I've worked my way up through the grits to 8,000. People ask why I don't use a buffing wheel and compound. To me, well, it doesn't take all that much longer for me to do it this way, and there is significantly less abrasive compound dust floating in the air when I'm done. I really don't want to breathe too much of that stuff because it's really, it's essentially like getting silicosis, your lungs have a really hard time expelling those particles. Polished, unpolished. I'm going to do the rest. I want to make them look even. Just surveying the amount of material we have to work with here. There's plenty on the bass side, not so much on the treble. I aim to remove a full 64th of an inch under the low E string, tapering away to nothing as it reaches the end of the saddle here on the high side. That will in effect give us a slight reduction in the action height on the high E, because it doesn't end up at the very end. There's like a ½ inch worth of material, so some small amount is going to be removed here as well, taking us probably below a 1/16 of an inch, 4/64, 1.5 millimeters. So I'm just going to do this the usual way. Doesn't look like much, but it does make a difference. Another helpful thing to do is scribe a little bit of pencil on the high E side. If you don't have a steady hand, it can be helpful to have something like this fairly thick metal rule. Could be a piece of hardwood or something else, to use as a guide in keeping things perpendicular to the sanding block. Okay, we're almost there. Just a little bit of black left on that side. Like I said, much too loose, so let's do something to tighten it up with Archie Bell and the Drells of Houston, Texas. Would not only sing but also dance as good as they walk. A little medium viscosity super glue on the back side. So it's a nice sliding fit. It's not tight, but it's not sloppy. Going to string this up with some Augustine strings. This is a normal tension treble, low tension bass set. So what do we end up with? How about 4 1/2 64ths on the bass side, 3 1/2 on the treble? That is electric guitar action on a nylon string guitar, and it plays cleanly from top to bottom and everywhere in between. You can't, drive it with a super aggressive strumming, of course, but we didn't expect to. It's very sweet. And yeah, I've never taken one down that far. I'm surprised it worked. I'm pretty sure that they're going to have to humidify it in the winter time, because we're close to buzzing territory, but we're not there. Now, from the sublime to the sublime, we have an interesting Yamaha guitar. It bears some resemblance to another fairly well-known American instrument. Can't quite put my finger on it. This is bizarre to me in some ways. Not the fact that it exists as a nicely made copy of a Les Paul, but this one has an open book headstock, and it was made in the early 80s, after that sort of thing was supposed to have ended. It's called the Studio Lord, which is a marvelous name. I believe this one is from 1982. They were introduced in 1976, and there were a bunch of different trim packages. This one is the SL450S standard. Some of the necks were maple, others were mahogany, some of them were bolt-on, others were set necks, rosewood or ebony fretboards, different inlays, different complexities of binding, 9 different models in total. I'm getting this information from a very nice web page put together by Bill Alston in the UK, who lists all the variants, and he's got some good pictures on there. I'll put a link in the description so you can check it out if you happen to have one of these under your bed. We know that Gibson has gone through phases of really trying to protect their brand from those who might copy various distinctive features. We hear about those lawsuit-era guitars from the early 70s. That's centered around Ibanez specifically. More recently, they've been going after smaller shops that make V-shape instruments, for instance. A lot of it is posturing. The gate was left open and the horse trotted off decades ago, and they're still trying to protect their trademarks when they didn't defend them previously. Now, the Studio Lords from the 70s had a distinctly Yamaha headstock shape. For some reason in the early 80s they decided to switch it up into a more familiar kind of curve. How? Why? Were they just feeling cocky or something? It's possible as a company they actually had more clout and lawyers on the payroll at that point, because Norlin was in the process of trying to find a buyer for Gibson. They weren't doing all that well. In fact, they got even more brazen in 1984 and changed the name to Lord Player, thus giving it the acronym LP. Those guitars were around to 1986, and then it all sort of stopped. Maybe this was possible because they were never marketed in the US or Europe. They were strictly for domestic sale to Japanese players. And Japan was riding high at that point. People had a lot of money to spend. You know, Salaryman-san might not be able to afford the actual 59 burst like his CEO did, but he could get a really good copy with quality control that rivaled an American import. This guy's got sharp fret ends. Fret tops are very flat. They're actually very reminiscent to a Gibson fret job from that era as well. Not a whole lot of crowning going on, so we might recrown and, you know, just set it up. The other thing is the neck pickup is apparently quite muddy for the player's taste. I'm going to see if we can alleviate that somehow. Action. Currently 4.5, almost 5 on the bass side, and about 3.5 64ths on the treble. That's not so bad. Neck relief. Capo at the first fret, holding the low E down at the body joint, checking around the 6th or 7th fret. Seems to be around 13 or 14 thousandths, which is a little much. Well, that is not a very Gibson-like truss rod adjustment cavity. Well, it's not a 4mm. Let's hope it's a 5. Yeah. Give it a backwards turn first. It's pretty snug feeling. Let's see what that does. About 8 thousandths. Let me try a little bit more. I think 7 thousandths is where it's going to stay. Nut slots are a little bit higher than they need to be, at least on the treble side. Electric guitar like this, I want to see 21 or 22 thousandths clearance. In this case we got over 25, so yeah, it's got to come down a bit. And on the treble side, I bet you it's around the same. Yeah. So, we'll get to filing. This guitar had the same fretting issue as the previous one. I won't belabor the point. This is really the job, folks. Hours a month spent scrubbing away at frets. Let's investigate this muddy sounding pickup. I don't mind the way that sounds. We're just going to have a look and see what kind of potentiometers they've got in here. Might be a couple of things we can do to brighten it up. These seem to be standard alpha pots, but there's no information stamped onto the case cover that's visible from above. I'm going to assume they're 500k ohms. Capacitors in here are 223k, which is standard. Now this is unexpected. This tone pot is Noble brand, and it's a 300k ohms, rather than the expected 500 we almost always see with humbuckers. Everything else being equal, this would make things sound a little bit darker. The neck pickup volume pot, however, is the usual 500k. Okay, you got an alpha 500k pot. That should work with the knob. Yes, that's good. And this will bleed fewer trebles to ground. Let's see what the actual value of this 300K pot was. 327-ish. So a little warm. So I got this all wired up and ready to go. Tried it out and there was some slight change, but not very much. Output from both of these pickups is perfectly matched at 6.6 k ohms. This is a tip from Seymour Duncan. What I can do is take a 0.47 capacitor, the same as we use in a Fender tone circuit, and wire it in series between the hot lead of the pickup and the rest of the circuit. And then it acts like a filter and keeps some of the low-end frequencies from moving down the line. This is the exact opposite of how it's used in a typical tone pot setup, where the high frequencies that get through are then sent to ground and removed from the signal. Inserting and removing the jack has been really unsatisfying. I can see why. This has got one of those plastic jack assemblies that is barely holding on at this point. Ooh, fragments. So I guess we should probably swap that out, huh? This is actually a stereo jack module, but I see no reason for it to be. Now, I really like these Pure Tone multi-contact jacks, not a sponsor. They've got an extra spring in them to keep things really secure and solid, so the barrel of the jack has no chance of wiggling. The old plastic was absolutely disintegrated, yet held in place. Got this wired up and was very pleased with the amount of articulation that showed up in the neck pickup.